So tonight we'll hear 5 short accounts of preservation in New Haven from across the last 6 decades, recounted by people who have been involved in or have kept a keen eye on these various projects. And we're going to start with a recorded video, which will last 6 or 7 minutes, and then we're going to turn to 4 live presentations. So we start then with the video. Last Friday, I went with John Herzan, formerly Preservation Services Officer at the Trust, to visit Marianne Mazan. Mrs. Mazan and her husband Richard were pillars of preservation in New Haven in its early decades, and she remains a committed and determined supporter of preservation, including for acting as an advisor to the Trust. We're going to play you a short conversation between Marianne Mazan and John Herzan. We've turned the sound up as loud as we can. You might want to turn it up a little further on your computer if you can, or whatever device you're listening on. John's voice is a little quieter, but Marianne can be heard more clearly.
Well, thank you for letting us come and talk to you today. We'd like to start by asking you a few questions about your memories of the Trust and your time in New Haven. It often strikes us that the Trust was ahead of its time. It was founded in 1961, 5 years before the National Historic Preservation Act was passed in 1966. And pivotal preservation events such as the destruction of Penn Station in New York City came after the founding of the Trust. Could you tell us about the early group of preservationists in New Haven and what motivated you all to get involved in preservation?
Well, it's my understanding that the original emergency was the proposed demolition of the Dana House on Hill House Avenue. And that started the movement. And then it was the days of redevelopment, and there was one emergency after another. The possible loss of the library, the post office and federal courthouse, City Hall. So it was an extremely busy time. And fortunately, the Trust was lucky enough to enlist a great number of very knowledgeable people. And they really worked hard, and I think did a wonderful job.
They sure did, and they got the ball rolling for future preservation efforts as
Right.
well. They were an inspiration. It's always impressed me how early the Trust was formed, that it had such foresight in being sensitive to the city's.
Well, the city was in a big state of flux. The soldiers had come back from World War II. They were moving to suburbia. Downtown was a disaster. And knowledgeable people saw what was happening to very valuable fabric.
And fortunately, they recognized it was
Yes.
valuable. Now, you and your husband, Richard, were a vital part of preservation in New Haven in the first decades of the Trust. Can you tell us a little bit about the preservation projects that had particularly special meaning for both of you?
Well, of course, Worcester Square, since we lived there, and that's how we got really involved. When Deb Townsend, who was spearheading along with Betty Brown, the historic districting, she went to Theodore DeLauro, who was a leader in the community, and asked for someone to assist with publicizing historic districting and telling people what it was. And Teddy gave her Richard's name. So it was Richard and Teddy's job to go around and interview every homeowner. And Teddy would go in and say, you can trust him. And then Richard would give the spiel about what historic districting meant.
So they were an effective team.
Yes, yes. And this proliferated into our interest. We went on to do Fairhaven, which had a special interest to me because my father came from Fairhaven.
Mhm.
And one of my favorite things was serving on the mayor's Grand Avenue Bridge Committee because there was an horrendous bridge proposed by redevelopment. And it was quite a committee.
Do you remember some of the details, what your strategy was? And
Well, I can remember the arguments, and the preservationists finally won. And we
Good.
got a new replica bridge instead of one humongous one.
that's huge. What a success.
But we also got an arson threat in the process.
Do you have any idea who it was from?
Well, I think we all knew, but nobody could prove it.
Okay. I won't make you say that the guilty suspect or the uncertain suspect. As you know, the Preservation Trust has now existed for over 60 years. How do you see it has left its mark on the character of the city that we live in today?
I think you can stand on the green and see the buildings it saved, the neighborhoods that it turned attention to and are now very viable, and they weren't back then. And one of my favorite things is the city survey, which has shown people the history of their houses and has been valuable in legislation.
And in my time at the Trust, it's been a constant reference for people who are trying to fix up their houses or learn more about their past.
Yeah.
So it's the foundation of all other activities, whether it's a historic district or a grant or whatever. I agree with you. That was a very vital contribution.
Well, what we found is people in inner city districts didn't think where they lived was valuable or desirable, and they welcomed education.
And it made them take pride in their
Yes.
homes as well, and buildings too. Good point. You've had a wealth of experience with preservation in the city. Do you have any advice to give preservationists today about how to keep New Haven looking the way it did?
They have to be ever vigilant. They have to monitor city plan and zoning meetings. And I'm especially concerned about the big box apartments that are going up and the very low percentage of owner-occupied buildings. I think it's time for a new back to the city movement, which actually the Trust did in the 70s and 80s by having innumerable neighborhood tours and lectures.
And was that effective in changing
Yes.
people's attitudes? Great. Well, thank you, Marianne, so much for delving into the past. Do you have any other thoughts you'd like to share with?
I can't think of anything else except I think the Trust has done a wonderful job.
Well, thank you again so much.
In 1991, Marianne and her husband Richard received the Margaret Flint Award from the Trust for their commitment to preservation in New Haven. And here we are 3 decades later, still immensely grateful to them for their efforts and indeed for the successes that they had.